Hello, I'm Dave Reilly and welcome to What a Relief. This issue we're going to be covering the cabinet doors, armoire doors, and so on. And if you're going to have doors, there's obviously you're going to have some way to open them. And what I'm going to do this time is talk about the door handles. Now, last issue, Dick Singh was showing us how to do these turned knobs. Obviously, I'm going to do more of the rectangular or the curved or carved type of knob. So the types that you can use, you can go from very, very plain to the very, very fancy ones. Here I have the simplest, straightforward, rectangular, cut out on a table saw style. You can get a little more elaborate here with a piece of inlay. But since this is the carving sequence, obviously I'm going to do some carving on these. You can get very elegant with leaves. This wrapped twig design is a very popular one. And then we have the leaves, different types. The type of leaf that I'm going to concentrate on today is this one here, which is an adaptation of the leaf that we did in issue number 4. So if you're familiar with that, this carving should be very easy to do. Now the first thing you have to do is decide on what the design is going to be of the handle that you're going to make. I'm using today for reference a leaf which is very similar to the leaf that we did in the issue number 4. But no matter what you do, you may have to do some serious design work. And as I have mentioned many times before, I like to use the modeling clay to work up my design before I start. In this case, I made a small plate with a reference size that I was interested in, my 3-inch centers for my mounting holes. And then it's just a matter of working out in clay, as I've done here with this leaf, decide if it's going to fit, what the proportion is going to be. I can make a lot of modifications, change the curve, so on, until I get what I wanted. Again, this gives us the opportunity to be very familiar with the design that we're going to make. When you're finished, you'll have the finished piece as a model to carve from. Also, sometimes if you're not too sure about your design, leave it and live with it for a day or two to see if it really is what you want. Then you can go ahead and doing the carving. It also gives you an opportunity to feel how is it going to feel when you use it actually as a door pull. You can make your adjustments and then you can go ahead and then do your carving. Now, as far as mounting is concerned, there's 2 ways of doing it. I can use a flat bottom as I have here. It gives a very substantial, very solid way of holding it. Also, for a lighter look, you can use these mounting posts. In this case, these are 1/2-inch diameter dowels drilled and glued into your piece. And it gives a nice lighter look to the design. Again, all of these designs, all of the things that we're going to discuss, it's all a matter of your own choice. There is no definite way to do it. Whatever way works best for you is the way to do it. Now, attaching your pulls to the cabinet door, the traditional way, and still a very, very good way, is simply using a wood screw. Sheet metal screws with a coarse thread are very good through the back of the door and on into your panel, into your handle. Now, this works very well. You can go a little more sophisticated. In this case, what I've done is I have threaded inserts placed into my handle. These come in very different sizes. I have here the type that is generally used for plastic. It's pressed in. It has serrations here that grip the wood very well, in fact. The other type, perhaps more common in woodworking, is the types that is screwed in. And they come in all different sizes, from 632 all the way on up to larger sizes. You can get them in some woodworking supply stores, or any good industrial supply organization will have these in all the different sizes. Now, there's a few things to remember. What I've done here is with the post, I've inserted the insert, pressed it in into my 1/2-inch wooden dowel, so that I can insert that into my carved piece. Now, there isn't much material here around, so you'll have to experiment a bit as to how that you're going to put these in. You don't want to force these in very deeply or very hard, or else you'll split the wood. So you're going to have to experiment a bit with the right diameter so they go in firmly. And then what I do for insurance, I put glue in the hole before I insert it. This hardens the material, the wood fibers around it, and they stay in very, very tightly. So those are the different ways of doing it. If you're going to have very, very thin wall area here also, be careful that you don't split them out. When you do carvings for the doors, it's probably that you're going to be doing multiple ones. The important thing is there that if you do one at a time, they're all going to look a little bit different. But if you do them all in one batch, sort of a production method, you're going to have a much more consistent and a more pleasing carving that when you're finished. Now, what I do is I lay them all out on a single board and then start doing all the roughing, laying out, building up little at a time on each one. If you do one at a time, it's going to be different than your next one when you finish that one and you go on to the next one. So do them all at one time. Also, using this sample here shows how we are going to carve this leaf today. You start by laying it out, then you do the roughing in, just getting the general shape of it. Then the next step is to go and get the rough in all of the curves and the final shape that you need. Then the last step is the detailing, getting a smooth finish or a tool finish as to what you need. And in our case here, the last step after that will be the undercutting to relieve it, to make it stand up from the panel that you're going to mount it on. Now the first step is getting your material. In this case, what I've done to have this raised section in the center, I simply cut it out as you see here with a table saw to prepare the stock. The next step will be to locate the holes for your screws or your inserts. In this case, I'm using a 3-inch center, which is fairly common. You do this first for a number of reasons. One, it's going to be a way that you're going to hold your piece down for the carving. Also, you have a nice flat, easy surface to work on to drill your holes. Now the next step after this is to hold it for the carving. Now what I have done in this case is I have made up a mounting block, or a holding block you might call it, where this can now be attached to your blank, and then with a screw, I'm using inserts in this particular one, I will screw it down tight, and this will be a way of holding it. So now that I have this attached to this mounting block, this block is going to do a number of useful things. For one thing, it's a way of simply holding your work. You can hold it in a vise, you can hold it with bench dogs, any way that suits your purpose. Also, when you finish up with this carving and you start doing some of the undercutting, you can still leave this on the block and you'll be able to get down in here to do all of this undercutting while it is still mounted on this block. Now, I've used the inserts for this with a screw through the bottom. If you're going to use the wood screws, they may not be as strong to hold this for the carving. I would suggest then you use this system where you glue it to your mounting block, but with a single sheet of newspaper in between. That will be a little added security. Then when you're done, remove the screws and you'll be able to take this off of the block. So then the next thing is simply to start our carving, and that can go in here, and it makes a very, very secure mounting. Now, to go over the steps of the carving, we have it mounted, ready for carving. The next step is now to do all this roughing to get the general shape. Get that done first. Don't get too tied up on detail. Get your general shapes first. So here we And just start getting the shape. If you're going to be doing a lot of these, it might make sense to cut this shape out on a bandsaw or on a scroll saw. It does save a little bit of time. This piece is fairly small. It's not going to take too much. May even be convenient. You can lay this on its side so that you can easier to reach what you're doing. Now that you have the outline, draw in the other side. Pencil or marker is a very good friend. It helps you to stay honest as to what you have to work on. Now I have drawn in here the profile of the carving just to be sure I know where it is that I have to be. Now returning to our sample board, we've completed this shaping of the general shape. Now we're going to go in and start to get the internal shape and some of the profile that we're looking for. Now it's time to draw in your center line as to where you want to have it. This can be cut two ways. You can use the traditional V tool, works quite well, to establish where that centerpiece is going to go. Or you can use a carving knife. I sometimes prefer that, especially in softwood. You can make a nice deep, what we call a stop cut. It helps to define where you're going to be working. Then it's a matter of coming in and starting the cutting down in. That stop cut just is a place for you to have your waste wood go into. You're not wedging down in. If you're using the wood screws, be aware of how deep the screws had to go to hold it so that you're not going to cut down deep into them. We have a lot of room here, so this won't be a problem. But you do have to remember that there is inserts or screws that go up in the bottom of your carving, so you don't want to go down and hit those. That could pretty quickly spoil your carving. Referring to my sample that I'm going to use, I know that in here I'm going to be having this is going to be a high area and a high area to correspond to these 2 points. And then on the other side, this will be a high area. So just keep myself honest, keep the samples or the markings going so that you don't get yourself too far beyond so that you can't repair your damage. These clamps are very nice because it's easy to turn your work around and then it's still held nice and secure. A V tool to help cleaning these areas out. Now we've completed the rough finishing, which corresponds to this area here on the leaf. Now we have all the shapes, the curves that we want. The next step is simply to do the final finishing before we go ahead and do the undercutting. Now you have a choice of how you're going to finish this. You can do it either a nice, finely tooled surface, which I sometimes like over the sanded, to get a good, do it consistently and always do it all at one time so that your cutting approach, it will stay consistent all the way through it. Or you can, which is very common also, just go the sandpaper route. This being mahogany is going to sand and shape very quickly. Now we've completed these, in this case the sanding. I have the inside done. The final step here is to, using my pencil, draw what will be the center of the leaf now. This is to get this just about right. Then, and you can use a V-tool, or I prefer to use a knife. I will just make just a light center cut, just to form a vein down the center. It breaks up that blank area without it. Now we have a nice fine center line. So that completes this upper surface. The next step is to start and do our undercutting. And that can be done by just, you can set this block. This is another example why this mounting block is so useful. And you can see now what I've done is I have drawn in a line which is my reference for my thickness of the edge of the leaf. And now it's just a matter of taking, in this case I'm using a number 5 to start this working up underneath. I'm paying attention that I don't get into this center rib, which is going to be the support when it's attached to the door. As you can imagine, I would suggest that you select, if possible, your material that has a nice straight grain. If you're going to be doing this with a curly grain, it's going to be much more of a challenge. Now I can just start deeply undercutting, paying attention to where my line is. I can make little adjustments on that later on. And you will just continue working down underneath until you have cut away to the way you want to have it. Now in some of these very fine areas, you'll notice that I'm using the tool almost with a pencil grip, but I'm not disobeying my rule of having 3 points of support, because I have one as the tool, I have my thumb on the back as the second, and the third point I'm resting my hand on the back of the carving. So I can be very precise this way, just a different way to hold the tool. Now if you were doing multiple carvings, you would have perhaps had your material on a board with the 4, 5, 6 other pieces that you're doing. Now obviously you can't do that with this one in this position here, but this is the underside, and it's certainly not going to show. You've already established all of your curves using the multiple setup, so this would be the time that you would do each one individually, and it isn't going to won't be nearly as noticeable. You can see just very light cuts, working my way down in here, using a deep gouge. This happens to be a number 9. I can come in and do a little rounding just to blend it. Now I have a rather thick section in here. Since I've established this cut underneath, now I can come back with a flatter tool and perhaps blend those over a little bit more to give a thinner section, which will give it a great deal more lightness. But since I have my pencil line as my reference, I know exactly where it is that I'm going to be going. I can take this tool and thin out from this side. I'll end up with a nice, smooth, curved surface. One area in here, I suggest getting a nice sharp line to separate. That can be done very nicely with a gouge or with the knife. Then you'll simply turn it over, and then the other side is done exactly the same way. Now the surface is completed, the underside has been completed. We've done the initial sanding. The only sanding that is required now is the very final, fine sanding. The next step now will be to take this off the board and do any little cleaning up and trimming underneath as necessary. Now that completes the bulk of the carving, certainly carving that while it's still on this block. One thing to remember is that this edge, if this were a decorative piece, this fine edge would be really, very sharp. Remember, this is going to be a handle now that you're going to use, so you can much better to have these slightly rounded, more comfortable and stronger to hold. The next step is take it off, do any little detail on the underside, and we are finished. The final steps before the finishing is to do any little detail work that needs to be done on the bottom. You could, if you desire, you could cut this away. So it would be similar to the mounts that use that small post. In this case, I haven't. But what you do need to do is to round this edge off, and since you know where your inserts or your screw holes, whichever it's going to be, are, and that can be done very easily just with a carving knife. You can just get right down to the good old-fashioned classic whittling, and it allows the tip of the leaf to extend out. It gives it a little more interest when it's on the cabinet. Now that completes the carving of these two samples. Here is our new one. Here is the original. I hope this has given you some ideas as to how you can make your own doorknobs and drawer pulls. There's no need to be restricted by any type. They needn't be round or rectangular. You're free to do it any way that you like. Don't forget to send us emails with your comments or suggestions. We'd love to hear from you. This is Dave Reilly. Thank you for watching for Woodworking at Home.